This is the nameless protagonist. I appreciate your patience. Today, I wanted to review the last video that I put up that was speaking about Saimin Jutsu, the art of clouding men's minds. One of the most important points I really wanted to make with that video was the line I started out with when I paraphrased Ivan von Clausewitz. His general philosophy in his 18-volume on war states, "War is but a tool to compel others to your will by way of violence fueled by politics and morality. As such, the immediate objective of war is to disarm your opponent so they can pose no further resistance." I think the important thing to remember with that, and what I concluded the video with, is that all hostile action doesn't necessarily have to be violent. And that when you've been brought to normalize hostile action brought against you, and it's built into the culture, you've successfully found yourself under the effects of what someone could call conditioning or hypnosis, or again, as the scroll is talking about, Saimin Jutsu. I'm not sure if everyone saw the video that may be listening to this now, but I'll paraphrase in general what we were talking about with regards to how the use of spies and agents relates and serves as a vector to continually control your opponent. And it's based off the first line in The Art of War. Its intention is to actually conduct war without actually fighting. And this is what gives credence and precedence to the need of controlling the mind of the individual you're classifying as your opponent, rather than needing to actually go out and spend money on war and engage in long, lengthy campaigns that cost the country and the people that are trying to push the political agenda. It causes them to suffer in the long run. Believe it or not, there's a very, very small amount of resources that ever gets devoted to intelligence agencies that actually devote their job to this. Less than 10%, maybe 20. But the overwhelming majority, 80% or so, of an intelligence organization's efforts is essentially being piled into psychologically circumventing and dismantling the individuals that they have an agenda against. And this can carry out on a lot of different levels. As described in the video earlier, we did talk about how that could happen internationally. But what I want to focus on is how it's done, especially in the latter portion of the century, on a micro level. In other words, the socio-political manifestation of psychological warfare. And the key thing here is the language that's used to reclassify it and make it legal. Now, mind you, this is before we get into doctrines that have been created that allow for higher levels of surveillance, such as what we saw with the Patriot Act. That's not what I'm speaking about in particular. I think one of the more adjacent agencies that we're familiar with would have been organizations like COINTELPRO. And that's important to understand because that was one of the organizations that was created, or initiatives, which had a specific goal of targeting our demographic as we understand it. And if we don't understand the ways in which it was actually directed towards us, very little of its efforts were really manifested in a physical way. They never really needed to like that. Before I really dig into that, I want to shout out to anybody that's in the chat now. I see Anu 2019. Salute to you, family. I see Rashid up there. Let me go ahead and mod you up. I know you're pretty particular on who you watch in general, so I appreciate you sharing your time listening. Seventh Coast, I'm gonna hit you with that invite in a second, so you can go ahead and join the panel as well in a little bit. Wanted to make sure we had the three magi up here. But moving forward with that, I'll revise or recant the 5 kinds of spies, and we'll hone in on the particular spy type of concern. And I believe it's really the one that has affected us the most, and that has taken advantage of a lot of our cultural dispositions and our cultural disadvantage in the United States with the classification of Black. We'll tie this in together pretty soon. But we'll begin. From the 13th chapter in The Art of War, the breakdown of the 5 kinds of spies is 1. The local spy. Recruited from the general population, often lightly bribed, they can be anybody from the environment or the area of operations, and they're commonly referred to as agents. Number 2, the inward spy. These individuals are generally people with higher ranking and influence in the area which you wish to infiltrate. They can be people who were done wrongly with high-profile criminals or individuals that have been caught in scandals. What highlights them is normally their enthusiasm to work against the enemy. Number 3, the converted spy or the double agent. They are individuals who are typically intelligence officers employed by the enemy who have been bribed to report information to both sides. You could call that an entanglement. Shout out to Will Smith. But number 4, the doomed spy or dead spy, what I call the misinformant, and the topic of today's discussion in general. They are agents that are equipped with false information to intentionally throw off the enemy. The template of dead or doomed can be applied to any spy at any moment. Lately, this term, quote, useful idiot, end quote, is a very accurate moniker to describe this kind of spy. They're intended to be eliminated by the enemy once discovered, with little or no consequence to those who employed them. And that's key right there. Anyone in this web could be given this assignment of dead at any moment, and the agency would be any less at loss for losing them, and they would have served their purpose. And we'll get to the last one, the surviving spy or the living spy. When one thinks of the CIA agent seen in movies, you're usually thinking about the living spy. They're often individuals that have been hand-picked by the party to be trained extensively in mind and body and taught the ways of tradecraft so that they can deploy into enemy territory. It's intended for them to complete the mission and report back safely what was observed. Surviving or living spies are often called intelligence officers in the modern world. And that concludes the 4 types of spies. Yes, that's a good parallel, Seventh Coast. Salute, AB. Also, what's good, Fitness Mom? Trove. 2 Triv, I got you. 2 Triv, 211. Salute, fam. Thanks for joining. So, to remind you of the way in which they interact, initially, you want to take your money and resources, and from the general population, produce local spies. From the local spies, you learn the existence of inward spies and the connections that the inward spies have. The living spies can be recognized. From there, learning about the enemy's living spies, you can seek them out and produce financial incentive or lucrative hospitality to get them to work for you. Thus, you receive the converted spy or double agent. With this converted spy, you can then use the doomed spies used to thwart the enemy's attempts to spy on you properly. And with the window open, one can send out their living spies to gather what's needed and know with great confidence that they'll return safely. It's a known factor in psychological warfare when you're engaging in a campaign that the initial seed planting stages, oftentimes your goal isn't necessarily to create the double agents, but it's to infiltrate the society at some institutional level. If you can penetrate into the institution, you can then begin what's known as the demoralization phase, which at that point introduces a doctrine which may not be or intentionally undermines the principles under which that country forms or that culture forms. The term that's used in tradecraft for this is known as subversion. And likely you're most familiar with a lot of the doctrine that has come out lately to represent what's known as the demoralization phase. And lately it's been Marxism, along with that feminism. It's a bold statement, but when you look at what its goals were in its initial phases, it is intended to create a destabilization, so to speak, by shaking up baseline paradigms. And with that, you can then go along to the next phase, which is creating a problem and introducing the solution later on down the line, which is really the ultimate goal of trying to create the use for your useful idiots or your dead spies. For us, a lot of it is related to our experience on the plantation and the creation of what we call the Sambo, we'll call them, or individuals who have bought into this idea related to white supremacy, a coon, if you will. And an individual who, under the pretense of attempting to present positive information, or maybe they're looking out for themselves selfishly, create a false pretense, and in turn allows a greater agenda to actually meet itself out. I don't think I've seen that movie with Morgan Freeman, Seventh Coast. I'll have to take a look at that. But it's important because it's oftentimes under this invisible cloak of the institution and things that are reinforced by media that tend to really open up the gates for a lot of these things. Acutely in the manosphere, specifically here in the sphere that we really occupy, the Black manosphere, it's been this word gynocracy that's been a very solid vehicle for this idea of the fourth spy to really implement itself and continue to perpetuate. We've got a cultural plug-in. We have a cultural history to allow for it to happen. When intelligence agencies are looking for ways to create destabilization, they look for gaps such as that. When we look at our personal experience here, our initial destabilization came in the form of the role between man and woman on the plantation. People need to consider what buck-breaking did to the image of the Black man. And I emphasize this word man. The transference of information and fear with these images and the way they proliferate from generation to generation. You have, or we have, experienced a demoralization phase that has lasted 400 years. And as a result, it was the only way that the plantation could actually function. It required this demoralization process to prevent a physical manifestation of resistance. Because if you're mentally bogged down, if you're mentally demoralized, if you're mentally destabled, you don't have to make any efforts or have any fear of having a mounted resistance. And it's been the only way that this system of, we'll call it servitude, functioned. And most of the origins of this system did come from the Roman system of enslavement. I think one day what I'll do is review some of those older manuals that I was able to actually find. And it was very eye-opening to see the words of somebody who lived in 300 AD speak about the same things that we saw take place on the plantation over 1,000 years later. And it really goes to show that no matter how much time changes, no matter how much a culture changes, what remains the same is human nature. And that's why if you want to get to the root of repairing from this damage, from this psychological control, you have to go back to the root. You have to go back to where the initial seed was planted. For us, it was the plantation, and the vector was through the womb. In the video originally, I spoke about the technique known as genjutsu. For those of you who are familiar with the animated series Naruto, it describes genjutsu the same way in ninjutsu we describe Saimin Jutsu. The two systems follow what you know pattern-wise, the same thing that hypnosis does, to mean that it's a form of voluntary compliance. In a way, you have to agree to the hypnosis in order for it to actually be effective. But this form of agreement can happen in many ways. There can be an active agreement where you simply comply. A lot of your prefrontal cortex is involved. In other words, it's a conscious decision. There can be an unconscious compliance in the form of various psychological triggers put in place for you to relax your guard and slowly seep into the rhythm of the suggestion. This pattern really emulates what feminine energy represents, and why in genjutsu or in ninjutsu, specifically in the series Naruto, the most powerful form of hypnosis was known as Mugen Tsukuyomi or infinite Tsukuyomi. When you break down the kanji that Tsukuyomi represents, it's reference to the feminine manifestation of the moon, even though normally in Japanese culture, the moon is depicted as male. But Tsukuyomi in particular is depicted as female. The reason for this and the reason for the parallel of the feminine energy to the moon goes all the way back to Kemet. The power of the moon isn't in its light. If you try to compare the moon to the sun, you can argue all day about how the light of the sun is greater and make these long-winded attempts to diminish the effects of the moon. But the reality is the power of the moon is not in what you see. The power in the moon is what you don't see. Because without it, life on Earth as we understand it wouldn't be possible. You can't point to that, but you can point to the effects of it. Feminine energy works just like this. And the power of Saimin Jutsu or genjutsu, and specifically infinite Tsukuyomi, works precisely the same. At risk of giving some spoilers, I suppose it's a light spoiler, the object of Mugen Tsukuyomi is essentially to circumvent the will of the entire planet and place it under a kind of ultimate hypnosis where individuals go on and move on unaware that they're being controlled. It's kind of poetic because the creator of that series knew exactly what they were doing when they made those parallels. A lot of those Japanese illustrators and artists do what they can with some of those animes to kind of challenge people and the typical norms, especially since their society operates on a conformist-based template and model. But I want to tie this back into the moon, Genjutsu, and the womb as a parallel. We know that, again, the feminine energy is the power that's unseen. And the womb represents that place of origin. It's a reason why that womb is the inheritor of the culture. So if you want to place Saimin Jutsu over a womb or control over that particular gate, that's one less step, or it's one additional step of voluntary compliance you're building into the scene that an individual steps into the world with. And it's been through this vector that we as an aggregate have absolutely been controlled. And it's why that womb has been targeted for every effort to enact change and manipulation by getting you to agree to it. This is a profound thing because we can even see these patterns in the sphere now. Where does money follow? Where does money travel? Where the women are. This is an aspect of attraction that observes the power of the unseen. In ninjutsu, there's a saying, ninja only travel in darkness because they carry within them their own inner light. The metaphor to this, represented in the symbol, is the yin yang, or as they call it in Japanese, in and yo. In being the darkness and yo being the light. In most aspects, techniques, and scrolls are represented in this dark or light context. You can compare it to masculine and feminine. It represents the power that is seen and the power that is not seen. And if you look at the symbol, there's a little bit of the opposite and a little dot there to symbolize the interchangeability and transition of power and how one is used to anchor the other. I'll give you another guess of where that symbol originated from. It's the same place they got the parallels of the moon and the sun, Kemet. We understood these things before, but it's why when you get the two misconstrued and they're not performing in the roles that they're supposed to, you get this kind of disharmony and you find yourself completely and utterly subject to intentions that are literally degrees of separation away from you. The term generally used for this lately is social conditioning. But when you don't recognize that it's there, it just simply becomes culture. It's like many other things, a full-on corruption of a mechanism that was originally designed and created to protect you, that's been warped into some kind of sense to essentially control you. And if you're not aware of it, if you don't understand that you're under an involuntary suggestion, your mind will never draw attention to it, which is why we need to use language and keywords that identify it immediately, such as gynocracy. It's for this reason I wanted to begin talking about this series, because this isn't to do with the human being as a human being. It's got everything to do with the conditioning. When most of us have an issue with each other, so much of our behavior is intrinsic and automatic that many of us go through life not even questioning why we do the things that we do. Human beings aren't like other creatures that come born with built-in information on an intrinsic level. It depended on an extended network to allow that child to be properly socialized into the environment that they were going to be living out. Oftentimes, there are many different kinds of neurological connections one could make, potentials for you to go this way and that direction, and it follows in neurology what they call a use or lose system. So in your development, if you did not develop a general need to use something, the body went out of its way to not develop it. It wouldn't necessarily be assumed. And this is why and how culture became so important, because this is where you got the initial tools that you needed in order to survive the environment that you went out into. We fast forward to the modern era, where the environments that we live in has been so sterilized and reduced to an overabundance of options that result in paralysis. We don't pursue things because we don't see a need to, and as a result, we are subject to agendas that we don't even recognize because we don't ever question the origins of what it is we're looking for. And we just make assumptions on everything we see because we have anecdotal evidence to really support that, and others around us are doing the same thing. This is nothing more than hypnosis. In fact, at this point, the hypnosis, the suggestion, especially the ones you see on television, you're just following the same programming. It's voluntary. So we have to draw attention to these patterns. It's why words are important. It's why questioning your actions and questioning your goals are important. It's also why it's important when you see this behavior in others, don't judge them for it. Judge the conditioning. Speak to the conditioning. You would be surprised how many people are coming out of environments that they are very well adapted to, but they fail to realize that the environment they came out of is so artificial and dysfunctional that it's left them crippled in being able to function in any other modality, at least as an individual that isn't being given information to work for another agenda, which brings us back to the original topic all over again of the doomed spy or the misinformant. The gynocracy is operating in a way that it's continuing to spread misinformation by virtue of its tenets, most of which completely and utterly ignore the natural human dispositions inherent in men and women. And many of them inherit this from intersectional feminism. It makes an attempt through one of the greatest tools of illusion and control, which is this word equality. I think that's a problem for a lot of people, this word equality, because there's nowhere in the Constitution even where this word equality is ever written down in. And the only time we're used to hearing this word equality, ironically, is when Black men are standing up to defend some kind of cause, because we have been the main ones convinced to buy into this idea of equality. And it is the first step in volunteering away your own power that you have a right to, that you were born with. I really want that to sink in. Nowhere in the natural world does this idea of equality exist. What you have is equilibrium. The laws of physics recognize this. The laws of psychology represent this. You do this intrinsically without even thinking about it. It's just your conditioning has conditioned you to simply take it. Now, I'm not saying for you to go and be a tyrant, because there are natural governors, and this is exactly how equilibrium works. Equilibrium is nothing more than two forces meeting with each other. And if they appear to be at a stalemate, it's not because something isn't there. It's because two forces have created a mutual level of power relative to one another. And when you look at the way we're supposed to participate as citizens in this country, every other group of people have figured this out on a baseline level, with us as the exception. And as a result, we end up forfeiting our power under the pretext of the greater good. when in reality, that's nothing more than a slave rationalizing their powerlessness. And I know that's a difficult pill to swallow, but it's the only way we could have remained on the plantation. Consider this. If you understand that power is finite, power can't be created from some vacuum in space that just manifests itself. You have to cultivate it, you have to obtain it, you have to earn it, and it can only be disseminated. Like powers tend to aggregate with one another, just like groups tend to aggregate with one another. The phenomenon is known as the superorganism. And believe it or not, cultures and society functions this way more than you realize, with the gynocracy even being its own kind of superorganism. It's not something you can point to. It's not something that you can highlight, copy, and paste, but you can see the effects of it. It's why it becomes difficult to describe it, and why individuals that are very focused on a very narrow strip of understanding will say the gynocracy doesn't exist, even though the evidence of it is all around you. The main tool that's being used to push this idea of equality is the fear that somehow if you come into power, that you're going to do to others as was done to you. Why would that be? Because every action will transform into an opposite but equal reaction. That's just simply how the universe works. That's how, in the context of culture, this word justice was intended to be used. And it's oftentimes misused. And we oftentimes defer it. And that's nothing more than slave conditioning. You as a living being have a right to voice what it is that you've manifested under, what it is that has happened to you. Your pain isn't something that's supposed to be ignored. That doesn't mean that, you sit and cry about it. But your pain and suffering is just as real as anybody else's. Your right to vengeance is just as real as everyone else's. If you choose not to, it's because you're doing so from a position of power and agency, and you recognize that you can posture yourself better in another way. This is important because, again, not all hostile actions are necessarily violent. And we haven't learned how to do that, at least not to anyone else that doesn't look like us. And we need to really take the time to consider where this thought process was manifested from, where it came from, and why it was put in place, and why the gynocracy is acting strangely familiar to that palm-colored person that was on the plantation whipping us into compliance. You as a living creature, as a human being, do have an inalienable right to defend yourself and to express who you are as an individual without somebody else having to tell you. There's nothing equal about that. There's mutual respect. I want you to really consider this and just really ask yourself, do you really accept yourself? Do you really appreciate who you are? Do you really feel as though you have a right to have your humanity recognized without anybody judging it or telling you otherwise? I guarantee you many of us have grown up not thinking that and just assuming that, it is what it is, and try to keep it moving as a result of that. It's ironically a testament to your own inner strength that, in a way, you probably aren't even really aware of. That strength is inspiring. And as much as it is inspiring, that's how much it can terrify the others who've put this control over you. Question your conditioning. Question what put it there and why. Question the motive. Who benefits from it? Why was it put there? You'd be surprised how deep that rabbit hole goes. You do deserve that mutual respect. And you need to understand that you're not the only one that was subject to that. That woman that manifests her power through the gynocracy, the reason why, again, she was brought under control first is because she is the one in control of that invisible world that we all walk through, we all experience, but we can't touch it, we can't describe it, we can't feel it, but we can see the effects of it. That's where your attention needs to be at. And it begins by understanding who you are and what you are entitled to with the being that has a consciousness. Because without cultivating that consciousness, how are you supposed to understand where you even need to go? If you don't understand the point of origin of everything that you're looking at and recognize that there are threads that connect their placement there, you will always be manipulated by strings that are a degree of separation from you. That is the epitome of the spider method or the great web. And I warned you before, with these threads all around you that connect, do not get caught in the web. But I'll go ahead and put the link up for folks that want to come up and chop it up for a little bit. And we can kind of go over a little bit of this. If you have any questions, feel free to just dump them out in the chat, family. Let's see if this works. But shout out to Nicole Ali if she's still here. I know she came over earlier. We discussed some of the groundwork for a lot of what created some of these subconscious subroutines with social dominance theory. There's a very good probability that we're going to be doing a part 2 of that. You can definitely catch that stream on our channel. And in part 2, we're really going to dig into a lot of what's been happening lately in the sphere here. The anti-female movement, the anti-black male movement, all of it. I mean, at the end of the day, regardless of how independent you are, none of you live in isolation, even though you may have been convinced you have. You still orbit us. You're still a satellite. And the more we understand that your success is our success and our success is your success, the better off we're going to be and the faster you may find yourself reaching where you're trying to get to. Because a lot of us are saying the same things. We're just not listening to each other, even though we hear. What's going on, Seventh Sensei? What's on your mind?
Nameless. You know, as you were describing the great web, right? And I did put in the chat earlier the if everything is mind, right? How the mention of mind constantly occurs, right? Mind over matter. It's all in your head. It's all in your mind. A mind is a terrible thing to waste. What we are currently seeing is an imbalance in the mind, right? And the mind is begetting itself. And that imbalance is making it easier to fall into a psychosis. But for the sake of the conversation, the genjutsu or the conditioning of the gynocracy.
Indeed.
Now, when I think about the 5 types of spies, right, and I think about that shadow organization, I'll provide another anime reference. I think of the Althamen from Magi. rather
Mm,
than magic, right?
yeah.
Where their goal is their level of escapism overwhelms them, and they believe that seeking depravity would free them from such a fate that they
Mm.
believe they have been cursed with. So they continue to contradict everything that represents life, but relish in everything that represents death and chaos.
And it's interesting because that's literally a side effect that happens when you get caught in the abyss. Over
Mm-hmm.
time, when there is no more light, you find yourself needing stimulation of any kind, even if it's negative. And that's
Yep.
why in the beginning I made that point about ninja only traveled in darkness because they carried with them their own inner light. That inner light was actually the principles and reality in your truth with which you stand on. It's also why I made this other statement where a lot of individuals, they'll take this truth and instead of standing on it so that they can have a greater leverage and foundation to make things occur, they'll use the truth instead as something to cower behind. And what does that produce? Death. Just,
Exactly. You know, prior to you firing up this stream, I got into a very heated debate on my personal social media. I saw a post on Facebook where a bunch of women, black women at that, were celebrating, mutilation of baby boys, black baby boys.
what?
Yeah, and their justification for said mutilation or circumcision is a lot of the comments read, I don't want and I'm going to use more educated terms instead of using the words that they used, but I don't want my son's phallus looking like a worm or bye bye turtle, and it just looks disgusting. I don't like it, right?
Mm,
So now I posed three questions. I had so much questions, but I've only posed three, none of which were answered, which I was expecting, by the way.
hmm.
I'm going to read them all to you now, right? Let me pull this up. Just bear with me 1 second.
You good, fam. Also, salute to Bishop Red Pill.
Oos to
Oh,
Bishop Red Pill. So I posed question one. Why are you so fixated on your son's why are you so fixated on what your son's phallus looks like? I thought that once he becomes a man, he will be courting and getting sexually involved with another woman, someone that isn't you. Unless you think of or plan to, never mind. Question two. I wonder if the roles were reversed, how would you feel about it? Because there is a similar operation that gets done to girls, but the same energy isn't kept when it comes to girls.
hmm.
Question three. So boys forget because that was another one I heard. Oh, just do it to him, he'll forget about the pain. And I said, so boys forget about the pain while girls carry the pain forever? I'm befuddled and I would like some answers here.
Mm,
Am I overthinking this, or is it just Facebook and it's not that deep? Because when you're speaking truth to power about certain topics, they tend to minimize the severity of the situation.
indeed.
Now, from what I've read in most of that comment section, there was nothing for medical reasons. There was no justification for medical reasons or proof that there are medical benefits to doing said operation.
Well,
Only cosmetic.
they claim that there's a quote health component end quote associated with that, and you've got the automatic reflex that certain religions have towards it. So,
From what I understand, the when you're born, right, pre-cut, that is to protect you or to protect your organ from any fecal matter or bacteria that can cause damage. And as you age and you become an adult man, that definitely Yeah, wow, it was for aesthetic stores. It was all for aesthetics, and I was baffled to see the number of black women that were relishing in that and saying just get it cut, he'll forget about it. But when it was presented about young girls being mutilated, I'm pretty sure they would have a riot. They would this doesn't need to be done to babies. And I posed the last question before dropping the mic. I said, are we sexualizing babies? Is that what black women are doing now? You're sexualizing your sons before they could even like have a conceptualization of the world, you know?
And again, it's that profile that they've adopted from the individual that conditioned the gynocracy on the plantation. We have to remember that the feminism that animated the suffrage movement, the first and second waves, this isn't the same group of people that ultimately were conscripted to create intersectionalism. I think going into the Coombe River Agreement and meeting will really spell that out. And I think dissecting how intersectionalism not only marginalized Black men, but painted the moniker further of us being these sexual monsters that we were on the plantation under the guise of the Mandingo archetype. But before I cut more into that, looks like the three magi are up here now. West Coast, salute,
Who's
os.
What's going on, y'all? Um, Sensei Seventh, as I was listening to you talk about that post, um, it reminded me of the ecosystem and the economy of the gynocracy, right? Um, the way that it's been developed, it seems our role as man not or as property, it's come to a head and it's fully realized all the way down to when a male is birthed, how his privates and how his genitals are going to be presented, the way that they look, all the way up to when he reaches adolescence and how he's groomed and how he's trained in mannerisms, the clothes that he is to wear, so that he can be presentable. Sort of like when we were captured as slaves and sold off to the auction.
In other words, you're the next handler.
Exactly. But
hmm
instead of it being an individual from the dominant society doing this grooming, it's the women within our community who have subscribed to this type of mindset so that their male property can be of proper use within the economy and ecosystem that is considered the gynocracy.
Indeed, because it operates off the concubine dynamic. And it's interesting how, you know, it really does follow in the light of that. This book, The American Slave Coast, goes into excellent detail about how you would literally get your price appraised much greater by having certain physical characteristics, and how specifically Black men were killed if they didn't have certain physical characteristics that they were looking for, or any hint of physical disabilities whatsoever, including height. It's interesting.
Hmm. And to add on to that, I even recall when I was younger and in high school, one of the prevalent themes was what was in style at the time. So, depending on the male celebrity who was popular at the time, that would dictate which male would get the most sexual access and privilege, i.e., light skinned nigga season,
Right.
i.e., it's dark skinned nigga season. And it's again when you look at the web that has been weaved, and you see that this has been culturally acceptable, most in the community would laugh it off or it would be like, oh yeah, like let me quote unquote prep for, light skin season if I'm dark skinned or vice versa, because the markets, the gynocratic market
It's shifting.
is shifting. And it alludes back to even with stock prices, whether you're a bull or a bear.
Right.
And so
Wow. And it's funny because when you take that web and follow it all the way back to the point of origin in the center there, what was the comparison? You had the light skinned mulatto who had more access because they could get into the house and had a certain level of favoritism, followed by the Mandingo breeder. And it's as if there's an alternation between these two archetypes and the way they've been fully realized. But I want to point out the tradition that we didn't create these things. We didn't come up with them. These were literally things, again, that were assigned to us. And that seems to be the pattern.
Well said. I think as you bring up this analogy of the web, and as you know, we've been discussing the man knot over at the Seventh Coast Dojo. Tommy Curry points out that within this community, there is no waste of male flesh. So it doesn't matter what your skin tone is, it doesn't matter what your orientation is, it doesn't matter what your height is. You have a role to play, and there is a job for you to fulfill. And
You know
there,
where
go ahead.
I'm going with this ultimately is mapping out the networking of the gynocracy and the actual superorganism that the gynocracy is subconsciously creating. And it every way I try to twist and warp this matrix, it comes out with the same end result. And a lot of this came from studying the Mouse Utopia experiment and asking the question, how do you prevent the inevitable collapse? And the unanimous answer is two things. One, empathy, and two, purpose. And what's nature's most ruthless, calculating, and energy efficient system of organization that can be observed on a macro and micro level? The hive.
When you were discussing superorganisms earlier, and this is to tie it all back in, right? The handlers have created a supercharged black widow spider, right? And when you dive into the symbolism of spiders, right, and what they represent, which is the mystery, growth, and power, right? The shadows themselves. And it's to celebrate the what? The feminine energy that allows them to dive deeper into the dark recesses of themselves and create cold persona needed to trap its prey. Even in the essence of the web, when you look at it, it's so enchanting, the way that the silk runs, the lining, the pattern. It makes you want to go closer to it. And once you touch it, you're stuck. That is the chaos that she has been using to overwhelm those who've come before us time and time again.
We'll take a look at, again, that power of the unseen.
Mm-hmm.
It's what does bring you, it's how seduction and attraction works. And it's why it's brought under that context of Saimin Jutsu, because the web, again, is hypnotic. And what's the nature of something hypnotic? It's intended to disarm you and bring you into a sense of comfort and distraction. And oftentimes it's what you don't see that gets you caught in the web. That's why I use that particular metaphor. But when we expand outwards and look at the system of organization, especially after what West Coast was saying, I wanted to parallel that to the hive, because in the hive, everybody has a role assigned to them and they're serving one singular purpose, and it's to serve the queen.
Mm-hmm.
And it's funny as we talk about sort of the roles and what each of these roles and functions actually are to do within this ecosystem. I want to touch back on the power of femininity and its actual function. So I think that you brought up a great point in the sense that when it comes to even in this space, all power and all movement seems to travel with the woman.
Mm-hmm.
Even, and in that fact, feminine energy, its strength is in attraction. It's not in going out and being aggressive. It's to lure, it's to be welcoming, it's to be inviting, it's to be enticing. And for better or for worse, right now we're using feminine in the analogy of the web, because the web is its use a feminine type of force where it forces the victim in this case to be attracted to it, to be lured into it. But when the feminine energy is of a light of construction, then it can be used for something a lot more productive. And I think
Indeed.
that that's what's fascinating. It's that the energy remains the same, it's just the intent and how it's used.
And this is why this term in yo jutsu is utilized for it. So to illustrate your point, when you look at the yin yang, which is what symbolizes that principle, if you look at the different points of the yin yang, the portion of darkness has a core of light within it because it gives way to the possibility of positive to be done. It needs that bit of light to anchor itself. And in the inverse with the light side, it has that point of darkness in it because without it, it lacks the necessary flexibility so that it can actually solve problems. It's much like the construction of a katana. On the cutting edge, that steel is actually much harder than the steel that's on the further opposite side of it towards the rear, which is much softer. The intention is to have the hard metal around the softer core so that it has enough flexibility so that when it meets resistance, it can continue to cut, allowing it to be useful. But instead, we get these extremes of both. And when you have those extremes, you get those instances where the darkness blinds. And then you get the opposite instance where the light ends up blinding. Both instances result in not being able to see, and you can't do anything of any construction with it. On one end, when we see feminine energy running out of control, it consumes everything and nothing can be done. And when you flip to the other side and look at the way a lot of men are operating or forced to operate, they're not able to get anything done because they can't serve the role they were designed for, which is to go out and construct and bring order. And if there's no vessel to contain the chaos that feminine energy needs, what's the logical result that the hive creates? It literally transmutes. It takes that masculine energy and forces it into an artificial masculine out of the feminine. And so we get this odd role reversal. And so instead of things that are being supplementary and complementary, being able to take the feminine energy of being able to attract and inspire, it instead does the opposite and oppresses and represses. And the crazy psychosis of it all is that the men caught in this web are under the belief that they're the oppressors.
And to add to that, right? And I'm thinking about the law of thermodynamics, right? The So you have a situation where there is no equilibrium. You have that imbalance, which is gonna lead to instability and sickness. And when you create a incentive for being unstable, the energy really follows the path of least resistance. So eventually, that unstable energy is going to seek stability. But before, there's an interesting thing that occurs. Before you can return to stability, they normally snuff that energy out completely. And now they transmute it to gain more power. That is like the way right now, the political climate we're in, we have an organization that has been pretty keen on that, utilizing the masculine presence to gain more power to fuel its unstable nature.
Exactly. It has a very, very poor energy use to energy output ratio, if we're going to use nuclear energy terms. So, in other words, it can recycle its own people, specifically men. And that's how it's designed. And the only way an inefficient framework actually can operate that way, because it produces a massive amount of waste, because not all of it can be used, is that it must be getting a lot of its framework, not from something it constructed, but from something on the outside that constructed it, which is why the gynocracy absolutely is an artificial construct that has to be supported by the state. And if it's not supported by the state in all ways that power can be expressed, it would collapse under its own weight, because it would literally tear itself from the inside out, which is why it doesn't function anywhere else. And it's why when we get out of that system and get put anywhere else where that expectation of sacrifice isn't there, more specifically, that expectation of self-destruction, we actually can create something. And we realize very quickly how strong we actually are. And it's an interesting phenomenon to witness.
And I think that you're spot on with that, because if you look at the environment that we're in now, where the state is struggling, look at the condition of the gynocracy.
Oh my goodness.
Before, in Manosphere 1.0 and 2.0, they could kind of poo-poo and shun this sector off. But as the Gnostic BGS put it a couple years ago, when he said that based off of this environment, these women are going to come back. What are you going to do once they do come to the table? You're seeing it here in real time. People that you never would have expected to show up in these spaces looking to have some type of discussion, or if they take it to the maximum in creating their own panels in regards to the men in this space, the only changing factor here, the variable that I've noticed, is the environment. Topics and everything else have remained pretty much the same for those who have remained steadfast, but the outer environment is what's changed and added these new characters. And you see the results of the individuals who weren't prepared for this change and what their behavior is shifting to in falling for that web, in my observation.
You're absolutely right. And what I'm noticing is, instead of an actual honest conversion, what's occurring is what you see in a lot of hive like entities. So, if you remember StarCraft, the Zerg, right? What is the most unique characteristic of the Zerg that makes them so powerful outside of their sheer numbers and their absolute loyalty to their queen? Their ability to adapt to their environment. So if we understand that the underlying conditioning of the gynocracy is following a hive modality, and this is something I was starting to speak with you a little bit earlier, Seven. I'll go ahead and kind of touch onto it a little bit now to kind of show a difference, since West Coast made a very solid observation. I wrote down that submission and femininity is something that's supposed to be built in an ongoing process that operates in the background. Submission is learned early and encouraged in the early stages of development. Who will qualify is known as imprinting, and largely the culture is what decides this. The moment you, quote, choose to submit, it becomes a matter of submission being a commodity, and it places the act in an active capacity or an active role, which requires an upkeep and to manage it. It becomes subject to Briffelt's law and set to various conditions. And I gave a linguistic comparison. The statement, quote, I will allow you to be in a leadership role versus I do not accept your leadership role because I'm not inspired by it. And I said the difference between the two is this word allow versus this word accept. And then we go back to neurology, right? Where if you are animated by the gynocracy and you're making a disposition of adaptation, your role as a member of the gynocracy and being female is that you are the initiator of action. You're acting in a masculine capacity. Therefore, this word allow is an active word that you are creating the conditions for. It becomes the thesis that then gains an antithesis towards something else. In other words, to allow is an initiating action. In comparison, this word accept is something that's done on the receiving end. It's not an active thing. To accept is to be something passive. It's in response to an action that's done. And that's the difference. When you've got a neurological pathway and a modality of thinking that's embedded itself so deeply, it's difficult to replace that on a conscious level. In other words, when your conditioning is so deep that it's become part of the culture, it's second nature for you to adopt a role of being active, even if you're saying it's submissive. It's submissive with the condition. In other words, the conditioning has adopted and evolved to include a new way to present a commodity to attain the main primary objective, which is to control and maintain that dominance. So to give you an illustration on a neurological level, go look at your hand and have your hand face palm first. And I want you to try to move your pinky and curl it up and touch your palm with your pinky. And as you try to do that, you're going to notice it's a little bit difficult, most likely, right? And it's because the way our brains work, it's very inefficient, and it works like electricity and tries to follow the path of least resistance. The reason why it's difficult to just move that pinky finger alone is because the signal in our brains to make a fist is much older than the signal in the brain to try to move the pinky. The way it works from an algorithm standpoint is it first sends a signal to your hand to ball your fist, but it also sends an additional signal at the same time to keep all the fingers but your pinky from moving. And you see the conflict here. It's like this when you try to adopt the brain into a different way of working that it's not used to. And so as people begin to come back to the table to negotiate, they might find themselves in a position to where this idea of submission is actually becoming a new commodity. And they're taking this position of, here's what I'll barter. I'll allow for you to take charge, rather than I accept your leadership. And I think that's an important thing to remember as the gynocracy becomes more sophisticated in these times, and to highlight the point that you brought up. about the gynocracy only adapting to its environment rather than actually reversing the conditioning and the programming.
Oos.
Oh, yeah, because the to add to that, and I think that was very well said. Um, the gynocracy and this environment in general, when we understand that we're in the age of deception and in the age of using your mind and actual mind manipulation to control behaviors, everything else will be put into perspective. Because it's one thing for someone to say, I'm going to allow you to lead, versus I'm going to accept your leadership. Those who don't have a keen eye and keen mind would think that there's no difference between the two, i.e., words are important,
Mm-hmm.
because that's where deception, and this is where the double talk gets to go into play. Because even in her allowing you to lead, she still retains a certain level of control. And the people who are coming into these spaces, it's crucial for individuals to listen critically to the words that are being expressed and how they're framing it, because they can easily deceive you. Because we all have had gynocratic training, and if a woman who understands that and knows where to hit that button to shut off your defenses, you will end up being vulnerable again. I I think of Attack on Titan when you brought up that analogy, right? Where,
Aaron.
Aaron, exactly. It's like, I'm gonna go out and defeat those Titans. And more so, I look at some of the individuals who are in this space who are um, just involved in listening to different creators who are coming up as um, mindless titans. And to the unassuming eye and those who have been unconditioned or trained for how to take down a titan, it'll seem intimidating. But for those in the know, it's a simple deal. And so I think of some of the people who are very well spoken in this space, who will be like a Levi, in the sense of somebody can think that they're this all powerful individual who's yelling for submission from their woman, but as soon as they go against somebody in the gynocracy who is well trained and knows where to hit that nape, you'll end up dead and out of commission. So protecting your nape, because that is uh it's a humbling realization that
We're
with
not infallible.
exactly, we're not infallible. We've been cultured and we've been trained to be a part of this system and to be integrated. So as you're, powering up and, realizing the newfound power that you're coming up with, understand where your vulnerabilities are and protect that nape. Because depending on who you go against, they can easily bypass all of the strength that you have and go right to that vulnerability and take your power right away from you.
Because you need to remember, your purpose has always been to serve the gynocracy. And that's it. It's the initial debt you acquired by being born and looking like your father. It's the debt you earn on a collective level by being told that there's so many men that have become deadbeats and haven't taken care of the community, and it's your responsibility to go back and do that. Now, I'm not saying that to reinforce the narrative. I'm saying that there's so many algorithms of dependency and control that have been woven into you as a result of that. And your entire upbringing and conditioning has been done so that you can serve. But the reality is, it's gotten so bad that we're so used to doing so without any materials and conditioning that we can't even do that anymore without getting some level of compliance. And we don't even get to operate in that capacity without being told we're complaining. And it's why so many individuals end up in these spaces, because they're left giving every bit they have and they never first learn how to serve themselves.
Oos. What you just explained was the theft of our purpose as men and injected with an entirely new purpose that doesn't service us. While on the flip side, a purpose has been injected into the female counterpart, which is outside of their nature. Hence why, going back to the imbalance that I brought up earlier on, leads to sickness, right? Sickness of the mind, sickness of the body, and sickness of the spirit, to the point where it becomes self-deprivation and self-destruction in the end. So they're not even proud of what they created. So much so that they eliminate themselves so they won't have to be next to it, because what they created is so close to perfection once it realizes its true strength. So as we grow and continue to find our purpose, our true purpose, outside of the injected purpose of the gynocracy, which is to serve the gynocracy, right? Outside of that purpose, they know deep down that you will become unstoppable, brothers. And I think about the Attack on Titan reference you brought up, West Coast Sensei. And then I think about the nature in which Mikasa, very early on, went outside of her submissive state, and her mind was altered and rewired in that instant to defend Eren, who was fighting and protecting her. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And even though she had more strength than Eren at that time, she ended up reverting back to her SOP. She only uses that power to serve Eren, to produce better outcomes for Eren, not the rest of the team. And as you watch that story, it comes out every time who's in danger. Not the rest of the team, but Eren.
It's a very keen observation. It's what true submission looks like when it comes to being actual helpmate to a partner. So,
Let's be honest though. Do you understand how overpowered black men would be if we actually had cooperation with black women like that on a baseline cultural level?
Like I said, unstoppable.
yeah.
Oh my goodness, we got this far in spite of that conflict. You know, it's important. And at the end of the day, for the overwhelming majority of us, we still only wish the best for everybody we come in contact with. A lot of us just want the ability to protect us and the folks we care about. And that says a lot about a person's character. A lot. And more about us as a people, which is why it took this complex system of control, like this superorganism or this genjutsu, known as the gynocracy, to keep us under control. It knew that the only thing strong enough to hold that web together was a web created by her, and one that we volunteered to cooperate with. And that's something to think about. It's almost like the strength of the finger trap. You know, your own strength works against you. If you know you're not strong enough to pin something down, it's better to use something's own power against it. And that's exactly what's going on. It was really interesting to look at the video from the sister that's over in Gambia right now. I don't know if you guys saw that, but she made that video about the us dancing about death and all of that.
No, I didn't catch that.
Worth it. I'll see if I can toss you a link later over IG. But it was a refreshing video to see, and she was
Are
on
you
point.
referring to Kathy?
Yes,
Mm-hmm.
I think it's Art Kathy, right?
Correct.
Yes, that video. It's an example of what we were talking about. What it looks like to see cooperation and understanding what time it is. And it is important to use that nuance because, again, it isn't about the woman herself physically, it's about the conditioning. Pay attention to what animates an individual's actions, and you'll begin to understand what you need to speak to and why they're doing what they're doing and what their intentions are of you and for you. And once you can do that, then you'll be in a much better position to actually do what you need to do to protect yourself and those around you, and more importantly, grow. But yeah, definitely peep that video, West Coast, when you get time. And I guess we'll go ahead and get ready to conclude. We're going on an hour and a half now, man. But any final thoughts on the topic before we go ahead and shut down?
I'll say on to the brothers that have tuned in this evening to really begin to look inward. For the moment, ignore the inertia of the white noise that persists in this space and begin to ask yourself some troubling questions. Who are you really? What is it that you truly desire? And does it really service you? Before you answer those questions, because as I stated earlier, the mind begets itself, look outside yourself for that knowledge. And that knowledge is sitting right in front of you. You have circles around you, you have people that have observed you and can speak to who you truly are or how you project yourself onto them, and they can put that mirror before you, thus showing you your weaknesses and where you need to improve. So pay attention to that moving forward.
Us,
Us.
West Coast.
I'll say you have 2 eyes, 2 ears, and 1 mouth. So use each wisely and pay attention to what's not being said rather than what's being said as you see the web that has been constructed around you. Us.
Us.
Os.
And I guess I'll conclude. Those are 2 very powerful points that, were really the central theme behind bringing this topic up. In Naruto, there is a bloodline technique referred to the dojutsu. And the dojutsu roughly translates to eye technique. And one of the most popular eye techniques in the series is known as the Sharingan. And what makes it interesting is not that it necessarily opens the gate to all of these powers and everything. The most important ability it gives you is the power to see things for what they really are. Use that as a metaphor. And so that symbol that forms the Sharingan is the yin yang, with the other principle that naturally occurs when you take the sun and the moon, which we already know is a representation of the yin yang, and you introduce the stars. You take the thesis, the antithesis, and you get the synthesis. You take the mother and the father, and you get the child. It represents the Trinity, the understanding of the connection of what is, what was, and what can be. See through to the truth of things. Understand yourself to understand the world around you, and you'll see people for what they are. Don't judge them. Judge the conditioning. And don't get caught in the web. This has been the Nameless Protagonist, and my guest, 7th Sensei, West Coast Sensei. To the dojo, os.
Os.
To the chat, os. And you guys have a good day. Peace.